Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. You know, it's been a while since we've built anything out of black walnut. Years ago, I did a shaker wall clock. And it's also been quite a while since we've done a drop leaf table. But not long ago, while traveling in Savannah, Georgia, we came across a beautiful black walnut drop leaf table. And that's what we're going to build today, right here in the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Well, today we're in the lovely home of Vicki and Greg Guenther. Now, Greg is a local cabinet maker, and he works on a lot of the historic houses here in Savannah, Georgia. He's also a furniture maker, and here's one of his beautiful pieces. It's a Heppel white card table. It has a single plank walnut top, curly maple inlays, and walnut legs. Now, they also collect and restore antiques, and this is the piece I wanted you to see. It's a dining table, and it comes from the Piedmont region of Georgia, dating back to about 1820. It's made out of walnut, has beautifully turned legs, and what's nice about it is it doesn't take much room to store it, but when the leaves are up, it's a good-sized dining table. Now, look at this finish. I can see my face in it. And Greg assures me that he'll show me how to achieve this later. But if I'm going to build this table, I got to measure it. Well, here's our version of that walnut table. Now, I stuck to most of the original details, except for the top. The antique original was made from solid walnut, and we noticed that it had started to curl. We made ours out of plywood. Today you can buy veneer plywood in just about any species of wood, and it's a much more stable material. The only thing you have to worry about is covering the edges, and to do that, I wrapped it with solid walnut. Now, if you'd like to build a version of our walnut table, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. The first thing I want to do today is make up the sections for the top. So I've sized some of the 3/4 inch plywood, and I've milled up some solid material to band it. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to make a groove in the plywood, and I want to make tongues on the solid material to have a nice strong joint. To do that, I'm going to start by making the grooves here at my table saw. But before we work with any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. I've set up the saw with a 1/4 inch dado head cutter, installed a feather board to hold the piece tightly against the fence, and set the fence so that it's just about centered on the plywood. Now we'll run a groove on all 4 edges. Now, that groove is pretty close to being centered, but to make sure it's perfectly centered, I'm going to put this face against the fence now and run all 4 edges again. To form the tongues in the solid material to fit in the grooves of the plywood, I've widened the dado head cutter to 1/2 inch, installed this sacrificial fence because part of the cutter has to go under the edge and I don't want it to hit the metal fence. And I've installed 2 feather boards, one to hold the stock against the fence, one to hold the stock against the table. A pass on each face centers the tongue. For the last several minutes, I've been mitering the corners of the solid wood pieces to wrap the plywood field. Now, it's not a job that you can really rush. You have to take your time so that I get nice, tight joints. This piece is still a little long, so I'll trim a bit more off. Now, this is fussy, even with the laser. I don't want to take too much off. Just line it up to trim just a hair. Let's see how we're doing. Well, it's still a little long because it's open right here. Maybe I should trim off the long point a bit because I'm open here. All right, that's what I'm looking for. 2 more panels to go. To reinforce the miter joints, I'm cutting slots for these number 0 biscuits. And combined with glue, that'll make a really strong joint. All that's necessary to hold the pieces to the plywood is glue. And you might note that this glue is brown in color. It works better with darker woods. Even though the glue joint will be very tiny, anything that shows will blend in better. Now, the long sides of the blank are not yet glued in place. They're just dry. I want to secure the short ends first, make sure they're positioned correctly. Then I'll remove the long ones and glue those, as well as install the biscuits. A little glue in the biscuit slot, and then I can slide in the biscuit. I want to be cautious how much glue I use, because when it squeezes out, it would be difficult to get off the surface. Now, because it takes a little bit of time to get the glue on each piece, I'll set this one in place, glue up the other one, and then I'll clamp it. Well, it's always nice to have plenty of clamps when I'm doing a job like this. We'll set these aside to dry, and we'll start working on the base of the table. Well, it takes about 3 hours to turn out the 6 legs necessary for this table, and this is what they look like. I've made them out of solid walnut. Now, to make them that quickly, it really helps to have a lathe duplicator, this device right here. I start out with 2 3/8 inch pieces of square walnut. There's a little cutter tip on the duplicator right here. And down at the other end of the duplicator, there's a little follower. And the idea is that you keep moving it closer and closer to this hardwood template, which is the exact profile of the leg, until it cuts it out. It works great, it's fast, and every leg is identical. I've taken the prototype table and turned it upside down so I can show you the rail system. On the long sides, there is a sub-rail made out of plywood, and that's only seen when the gate leg is open. The table is also surrounded by solid wood rails. Where the solid wood rail and plywood rail meet the leg, I need 2 mortises. On the short ends, I need 1 mortise in each side. And on the end where the gate leg actually closes, I only need a mortise for the plywood sub-rail, and that's held to the inside. I have to pay real close attention to my plan to make sure I lay out the mortises in the right locations. Well, can you imagine what it was like to cut the mortises in that antique original with a hand drill and chisels? Must have taken quite a bit of time. Here's the material for the rails of the table, and the next step is to make tenons to fit into the mortises. Here are the short rails. These will be the long rails, and later I'll mill the interlocking wooden hinge in the middle, so they're extra long, but I want to make the tenons now. And here are the long plywood rails. All the tenons are the same length, so I've set the rib fence so that it's 1 1/4 inches from the far side of the blade. And I've set the height for the tenons in the solid material first. I'll make a shoulder cut on each face. I've now lowered the blade to a little less than 3/16 of an inch to make the shoulder cuts on the plywood rails. Another adjustment to the height of the blade, this time to a 1/2 inch, and I cut the top and bottom shoulders on all the rails. At the bandsaw, I can remove the waste at the top and the bottom of each tenon. The last cuts to form each tenon are the cheek cuts, and to make those I use my tenoning jig. I've run a sample. These should be just about right. One more check for the fit. That's just right. For the plywood rails, I had to readjust the jig to account for the fact that they're thinner than the solid rails. Let's take another look at the prototype. The system of attaching the top to the base is simply a groove in the rails and these wooden clips. I'll make the groove at the router table. I'll drop it over the bit so that the tenon is forward of the bit, run it through and remove it before I reach the other tenon. Well, now it's just a matter of a little bit of final fitting and some sanding. We'll assemble these pieces first thing in the morning. Well, good morning. I got started today by gluing up that base, which I finished fitting last night. We'll let it sit in the clamps for a while and start working on that gate leg. Over here on the workbench, I have one of the long rails that I milled the tenons on yesterday. And remember, I said there was enough material to cut out the two pieces to make the gate leg. So here are the pieces cut to size. And I have a sample of the hinge detail. On the fixed rail, what I want to do is cut out 2 notches and then bevel the back so that the hinge can work freely. On the pivoting side, I want to make 2 fingers which interlock with the fixed piece, and it's all held together with this dowel pin. I'm going to remove the material to make the interlocking joint at the table saw using my miter gauge, which I've attached a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to give it some height and extend the length. I made one pass through with a 1-inch height on the saw blade, and this is for the fixed rail, and then I put 2 layout lines, one here and one here. I'll start by setting the piece vertically in against my right-hand line, make a pass through, slide it over to the left-hand side, make another pass through, then nibble away the material in between. Let me show you how I will remove the material in the opposing leaf of the hinge. First, I move the miter gauge to the other slot. Then raise the blade to 1 5/16 inches. There are 3 guidelines on the jig. First, I'll start to the one on my left to start removing the material at the center. 1 pass here, and slide it to the one on the right. 1 pass there, and then nibble away the material in between. At the top and bottom edge, I'll start against this guideline, make the initial pass, and remove the material all the way past the edge for one, then flip it over and do the other one. With the pieces together, you can see that there's not much play. I want it loose enough so that it'll pivot easily. The next step is to remove the material on the back of the fixed rail. And to do that, I'm going to clamp it in the side vise, make a couple saw cuts down to my layout lines, and remove the material with a chisel. With my saw tilted to 45 degrees, I've just made a couple bevel cuts on the pieces so that they will fit together properly and they'll clear as they pivot. What I've done here is set up to drill the hole for the pin in the pivot. I made a jig for my drill press, which is perpendicular to the table and parallel to the drill. I've clamped it in place, and then I clamped the rails to the jig. I want to drill a 3/8 inch hole about 1/4 inch shy of the bottom. All right, now that's as deep as I can go with the throw of my drill press. To complete the hole, I'm going to raise the table up, letting the bit slide through the part of the hole I've already drilled, and then I can complete it. Before I can attach the solid rail to the plywood rail, I need to make a couple more mortises, and that's to allow for clearance of the hinge as it comes open, and it'll also act as a stop to make sure that the gate leg doesn't go too far. I've laid out the 2 mortises. I'll remove the material with a 3/8 inch straight cutting bit, freehand, and then clean up the rest of it with a chisel. Now I can attach the fixed rail. I've applied glue on the tenon. I'll slide it in, clamp it in place, and then attach it with some screws from the inside. Back here, you'll never see these screws. The gate leg will get glued to the tenon on the rail just like the others, but before I do that, I'm going to have to notch this leg so that it fits around the plywood rail and will be flush with the fixed leg. Otherwise, the leaf wouldn't be able to fold down. Now it's just a matter of applying glue to the joint, assembling it, setting it in some clamps. Then we'll get to work on the top. Now with all the tops sanded smooth, I'm just rounding the corners of the leaves, just using a sander. To ease the edges of our tabletop sections, I'm using a 1/4-inch radius bit, just a little bit of it. I'm going to ease all the edges away from the hinged side, both at the top and at the bottom. Let's take another look at our prototype and check the joint along the edge of the drop leaf table. It's a classic joint known as a roll joint, and what's nice about it is that as you lift up the leaf, it laps over the center part of the table, providing support all along the joint. I'm going to make the round over on the center section first, and to do that I'm using a 1/2-inch radius round over bit in my router table, and I've installed a feather board to keep the panel tight against the table. I'll run it with the face down. Now you might have noticed that I used a piece of scrap wood as I was finishing up that joint, and that's so I'll minimize any possibility of tear out as I finish up. For the corresponding side of the rule joint in the leaf, I'm going to use a 1/2-inch cove cutting bit, and I'm going to run the piece through face up. All right, let's check it. That's good. Now I can do the other leaf. Here's a sample of the rule joint and the mortises for the hinge. The drop leaf hinge is a specialty hinge with one leaf being longer than the other. On the fixed portion of the table, I need a mortise for the hinge and a slight recess to account for the knuckle in the hinge. On the drop leaf, I simply need a mortise. To make those mortises, I've taken a piece of 3/4-inch plywood and formed a template. I also attached some 1/4-inch plywood on the edge that hangs down slightly to locate the jig. To remove the material, I'm using my router, which is set up with a collar and a 3/8-inch straight cutting bit. Now with most of the material removed, all I have to do is clean up the corners. And to do that, I'm going to use this chisel, just a corner chisel, which is spring-loaded. I locate it in the corner, give it a tap with my hammer, and it squares it up. A round nose bit makes the recess for the hinge knuckle. The hinges are secured with a 1/2 screws in pre-drilled holes. All right, now's the time to attach the gate leg. Just a piece of dowel stock, and we'll trim it flush at the top. Here I'm forming some clips that I'm going to use to secure the top to the base. I like to use these wooden clips in these grooves because it allows for some movement of the top with changes in humidity. All right, one final piece. This little filler made out of solid walnut, just attached with some glue and nails to fill the gap between the gate leg and the fixed leg. All right, well, there's another one. Now let's return to Savannah and go to Greg Guenther's workshop, where he has some ideas about how to finish a piece like this.
Norm, here's a walnut piece that I've run first through the thickness planer, which would have come out appearing just like this,
Just like
this section.
Right over here, yeah.
Smooth, but here I've hand planed it, scraped it, and then sanded it to a nice smooth 220 grit.
That is smooth.
Then we're going to take boiled linseed oil that's been thinned with mineral spirits and apply it with a cotton cloth. And you can...
It's important that it's linseed oil because so that it'll dry. How long will you let that dry?
After wiping off the residue, Norm, I'll let that dry a couple days. Now over here, Norm, we have a section of walnut where I put the oil on and it's sat around for 2 days. And we're going to apply some shellac to the surface as a built-up protective top coat.
Now, what kind of shellac are you using?
This is orange shellac, which we've made from shellac flakes that we've dissolved in alcohol.
And how many coats will you put on?
We're going to apply probably 10 or 12 thin coats.
A couple of questions. How much dry time between coats?
We can wait a couple hours if it's very thin. If you're using thick shellac, we should let it sit overnight.
And you don't worry about dust falling on it?
No, because in the final polishing steps, we can take care of any problems.
Okay.
Here in this end of the shop, Norm, we have a mahogany dressing table from a local house museum. We've built up 12 layers of shellac on here, just as you will on your table, and it is dried, and we are ready to polish out the brush marks and dust with 400 grit and 600 grit wet dry sandpaper. Over here we have a door panel where Mark has already sanded and is now polishing with steel wool.
What grade is steel wool?
We're using a 4/0 steel wool. The next step is to apply a thin coat of a quality paste wax, allow it to dry, it'll slightly lose its gloss, and then buff it out with a cotton cloth. This restores the shine and adds a little protection.
Boy, that looks great. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time and sharing these techniques with us.
Well, thank you, Norm. If you have any other questions, please call.
You can count on it. Thanks, Mark. Well, I can just about see my face in this top. Maybe another half a dozen coats of shellac with 3 or 4 coats of wax on top of that would do the job. I sure hope that Greg Guenther down in Savannah approves. This is a really nice piece.